Right, well, good evening, everybody, and welcome again to KPMG for the fourth and final one of these Wednesday sessions, this one on finance. So my name is Piers Ricketts. I'm a chartered accountant by background, which is why I'm doing this. I'm a partner in our healthcare advisory group. So I'm going to ask you a question, first of all. What is the annual budget of the NHS, roughly?
104 billion.
Very good, absolutely. So we've rounded it to about 100. Looking at the stats, 99.8 billion, but obviously capital expenditure and various central bits come off of that. So most of that, give or take 10 billion, which is pensions, gets devolved down towards NHS bodies and the strategic health authorities, and the majority of it obviously goes into primary care trusts. So some 80 billion. Which is used, and I'm speaking in very rough terms here, probably about 30 billion or so is used to pay for primary care, and the rest is spread over acute, mental and community, very, very roughly. So you're talking about enormous numbers. It's the biggest government department after Department for Work and Pensions. As a comparison, defence is only, in inverted commas, 36 billion. So it's about 3 times the size of the defence budget. It's absolutely enormous. And things can get lost in the rounding. And I think part of the idea of GP commissioning surely is if you devolve things to a local level, you can actually control stuff in a smaller and more material way than if things just get sort of rounded up at a county or an SHA level. So how does that money currently get devolved? Well, obviously in terms of contracts, PCTs strike contracts with healthcare providers, and there are capitation fees that are currently paid to GP practices, based on the capitation per head of population. Those allocations are made at a PCT level based on complex economic formulae, which I don't pretend to understand, taking into account various demographic and epidemiological data, which therefore says that if you live somewhere like a relatively deprived area of the northeast, you get more per head than if you live in Surrey or Sutton or anywhere else like that. We don't have a view on the extent to which that's going to change. I think you've probably got to assume for the moment that it's not going to change materially. There is a look at these things from time to time, but I think the starting off point would be that nobody is suddenly going to get, barring some special cases, when all this starts, no one's suddenly going to get an increase in their capitation fees, because that's how Treasury does it. It's a separate team within DH that does that, and I wouldn't imagine, well, you certainly shouldn't bet on getting any more money from that area. So not good news to start with. What's it going to look like? Well, we're going to remove, or the Department of Health is going to remove, as you know, 2 of the largest pieces of the jigsaw. So obviously, assuming the same amount of money, and we'll come on to that in a minute, SHA is replaced by the National Commissioning Board. Now, clearly how the NCB is going to work isn't yet determined. It's going to be a pretty large organisation because it's going to have regional remits. So the idea that each of you, as a GP consortium, or representing a GP consortium, can report directly up to this new body in Leeds, just with no link in between, I think is somewhat fanciful. So they're working on the structure that it needs to have. But I think you can expect some levels of middle management or middle intervention in between the commissioning board and yourselves as consortia. Not yet sure how that's going to work. So the idea then is that you as consortia are going to get roughly, well, 70 to 80 billion, so most of that money that we saw going direct to the NHS. Obviously, some of that will be ring-fenced, so the amount that relates to your GP practices and the capitation fees that you get will be paid in one way, and the amount that represents your commissioning budgets will be paid differently, because clearly one of the hardest things for people like us to understand is actually how you assure that the two don't kind of somehow get merged, and you do quite well out of it. So that's roughly how it's going to work. Clearly removing that very considerable layer of infrastructure, 152 organisations just disappearing, places an enormous burden on yourselves. And I think this is the really scary thing. Treasury, as far as we know, has still not completely got its head around this, because there are real implications to this. Some PCTs overspend, but because you've got the SHA control, you total things up, and generally you can move money from here to here and you can sort of make it balance. And the budgets that you guys will be in charge of would probably put you into the FTSE 350, most of you at any rate, if you were a limited company or a PLC. So we're talking about an enormous transformation in the scalability and the reach in financial terms that you're going to have. So what are the different duties that NHS organisations have at the moment? Well, there's a number of different ones you can pick out, but what we've put here is the obvious statutory break-even duty. So as a PCT or as a hospital, you have to break even, plus or minus a little amount, but essentially break even. In the old days, of course, if you made a small surplus, you had to hand it back centrally. If you made a small deficit, it would get taken off next year's budget, and then you sort of gradually climb into a deeper and deeper hole. With FTs, that's not the case anymore, of course, but there is the break-even duty. That's the fundamental kind of accounting principle, which I don't imagine is going to change with commissioning consortia. So you've got to live as a PCT within your annual revenue resource. So a PCT, let's say, gets a budget of £500 million, can just draw it down in equal twelfths or however it agrees with the SHA, and you mustn't overspend. So in terms of the DH, trusts must meet their annual revenue control total, and everybody has to meet the Better Payment Practice Code, which essentially means that you've got to pay 90% of your suppliers within a reasonable amount of time, which I think is 30 days. Not all of them achieve that, it has to be said. So those are the simple things that you need to be able to do. Obviously, how do providers get paid at the moment? Well, there's a difference between block contracts, which essentially is how community services are remunerated and mental health is remunerated, and tariff, which is how most of acute procedures are remunerated. What things seem to be moving towards is tariff as a cap, so a kind of maximum agreed price. And obviously this is where any willing provider comes in, and the idea is that tariff is a sort of benchmark, but clearly if you are a young and innovative service offering parts of MSK, for instance, which the local acute trust traditionally does, you can do it in the community and cheaper, using tariff as a benchmark, but still being able to make a return, but because you are small and efficient in the community, that's kind of how the numbers add up. So that's how the financial flexibility in terms of price setting is going to work, and also monitor will become the new setter of tariff as opposed to merely the regulator of FTs. So that's a huge shift. Local prices, certainly seen in mental health in the absence of a tariff, which originally was announced for 2007 but is proved pretty complicated to implement, are often on local contracts, and particularly for the more acute end of mental health on sorts of cost and volume contracts. So for instance, we will provide you X number of low secure bed days per year. We'll charge X £100 per week for those, and you'll just buy those either on a planned or a spot basis at those prices.
Have we given up with having a go at it, or have we got an end point about when we will have mental health?
I'm not aware there's an end point. There is a group of about 10 or 15 mental health trusts, most of whom are based in Yorkshire and North West in the north of the country, who have got lots of proxies running. So there's a kind of benchmarking club where they've categorised all the different sorts of interventions, which obviously run into the hundreds in terms of numbers, and they've got a shadow tariff running. So they benchmark current operations to say, if we would be paid in this way, would we be making or losing? But I'm not aware of the timetable for that to go live nationally. I don't know. The other one they're trying to do, of course, is a tariff for community services, which again is running in a similar way. I think the government definitely does have an intention to introduce that, but again, it's quite hard to understand how it would work.
The thing is when I sit around with our finance people and I say we're not really getting this service, but we're paying for it anyway, and I say, well, why don't we not pay it? Because that's a lever to make people, get us their receipts on time and so on. They say, no, we'll be told that we have to pay it anyway. So
but valid, contractual challenge, valid or otherwise, is different from that. Assuming you have an invoice which you agree with and the work's been done, price is right, you need to pay it within a certain time period. That doesn't, officially at least, impact on your ability to question an invoice for which you believe you haven't received the services or that's wrongly filled out. It's a slightly different thing. It shouldn't be held against you.
It's just that I just see there's a lot of cowardice. It seems that the PCTs at the moment are there to keep places open. It's a cozy club, and nobody wants to upset anybody else.
Well, we're going to get to an interesting debate, and then
Well, this is the point really, and can't see how we can make a difference if, you know, this is a cosy club that's been going on, and people playing with gentlemanly rules that regardless of what happens you end up paying anyway as commissioners.
I mean, in the early days of FTs, there was an instance where the PCT decided to get stroppy with the first wave acute trust for various reasons. And it very nearly put the acute trust out of money. They were in serious difficulty of not being able to pay payroll. You know, they had something like 5,000 invoices. Each one was just being challenged and put to the bottom of the queue. And they made a point that, you know, we can't do this if you don't play ball.
But my point is really developing Aniello's earlier point that, you know, we develop an intermediate tier service for gynecology. We refer large numbers of patients into there, and fewer patients, not quite as many as we'd hope, but fewer patients to secondary care gynecology. And yet our secondary care gynecology spend goes up with the same lines everything else is going up, because somehow those patients are more complex and they've jumped across a few different tariffs. And you know, the trust still gets their money and more despite what we're doing, and it seems like we're paying for double running, and it seems like we're going to bust ourselves. So that's, I don't know if that's gaming, but it's certainly manipulating the tariff. And how can we stop that happening? Because the tariff is changing every year.
Yeah, it is.
When you've got to have access to very complex informatics and really to understand what the drivers of that kind of behaviour are, you need clinicians. And those of you who have heard Anthony McKeever on the Today programme and some of his appearances, you know, he's not afraid to challenge those sorts of invoices. You see it a lot of the time in the frail elderly. So what you've described, I've seen in a couple of PCTs in the southwest, where they say our GPs, our consortium, is really good at having care plans for the top 1,000 or 2,000 elderly patients with complex conditions in our area. And we know that those people, by and large, don't have to go to hospital, or they go to hospital far less often than they used to. But that cohort of patients, using certain HRG codes, so the numbers being referred are going down, but the amount we are paying once they get in there is actually going up. So what's going on? And they don't know what's going on, because it's actually quite hard for an organisation which is not run by clinicians and doesn't necessarily have access to great data to be able to get to the bottom of that. There are various different ways you can do it, but you do need, ultimately it's got to be clinically led, because you pull off the data from the hospital's PAS system, so you see who's been admitted, what's been done to them during any given month, and then what you then need to do, and this is where the relationship's coming, you need to be able to go in and question the consultant and say, what happened to that patient? You know, I'm paying for this, I need to know. And it's impossible to do that if you haven't built up the kind of working relationships which other industries have.
We're going to inherit a bunch of contracts that have already been negotiated, and then, but in 5-10 years we could build that into our contracts on how we want them to report their data.
Well, less than 5 or 10 years. I mean, you know, in the private sector, you know, big contracts. I mean, the industry. This is quite wide-ranging here, but I think it sort of goes to the heart of the industry that we often talk about in this context is the automotive industry. So highly sophisticated. You know, there are not that many global automotive manufacturers because it's quite difficult to make cars, and they are all very closely aligned with their suppliers in such a way that there's the relationship of dependency. So yes, if you make, I don't know, batteries for Toyota, clearly it's a very good position to be in because you'll have a very large contract, but it's probably the only company that you make batteries for, and therefore there's a real dependency. So the annual contracting round, or probably contracting round every 2 or 3 years, is very competitive, but once that's done, Toyota knows if it doesn't actually align its interests and the supplier's interests in the same way, it won't get its batteries on time, and they'll be defective, or they'll be made subcontracted out somewhere else because the price isn't right, and therefore they have to work together. And obviously in health, we are, the way that the system's been set up in this country, we are so far away from having those sorts of constructive relationships. And the theory, at least, is that you as clinicians can actually eyeball acute trust clinicians in a way that I can't, even if I suspect a problem. You can actually start to have those conversations. So that's what, when we talk in other parts of this programme about transformational leadership, that's one of the things that it's got to try to address.